On August 11th, 1983, Raylan Toporov sat at her home in suburban Oak Park. She began looking at the newspaper. There was an article that a deportation trial had just been initiated by the Justice Department downtown. A Nazi was being deported. As she read the article, though, two words jumped off the page. Oak Park, her hometown. This Nazi? He was the chief custodian at the local high school, the one a few blocks away, the one that her Jewish children were soon to attend. If there was one town in the country ready for a case like this, it was Oak Park. The community had built its reputation nationally on its commitment to diversity, had won a recognition as the all-American city due to its intentional efforts to racial integration in the 1970s. And in 1980, Oak Park shouted down a neo-Nazi rally in town. 3 generations of Oak Parkers came to counter-protest and hurled insults and vegetables until the would-be fascists fled under police escort. I'd love to tell you the same thing happened here when Reinhold Kula faced deportation, but it didn't. A couple hours after reading that newspaper article, Ray Lynn and her friend Rima Lunen-Schultz walked into the federal building downtown where the court was being held. When they entered the courtroom, they were struck by a pretty shocking dichotomy. On one side of the room, elderly women, clearly Holocaust survivors, sat together. On the other side, Reinhold Kula, decorated member of the SS Death Head Division, a guard at the Reich's most brutal slave labor camp. Rima and Ray Lynn instinctively went to the survivors. One grabbed Rima's arm, crying, and said, "Thank you. We didn't think anyone would come." A few minutes later, the courtroom door opened again, and their children's teachers walked in to the same courtroom, the same survivors, and the same Nazi, and chose to sit on the other side of the room. Oak Parkers, they had expected to rally against Kula, but the opposite happened. They rallied for him. They wrote petitions requesting that he keep his job. They testified in his behalf at the trial. One school administrator falsely swore an oath of affidavit saying that he didn't have a single complaint in his personnel file, which was not true. They wrote letters to the local newspapers, and they raised money for his legal defense. All for a Nazi, an admitted Nazi. Nazis may loom in the American consciousness as evil epitomized, but the efforts to bring them to justice here were not well received. Hundreds of Reinhold Kulas were gradually discovered here, men who had patrolled concentration camps, selected Jews for execution, or even participated in mass shootings, were now living ordinary suburban lives. And as the Office of Special Investigations raced to uncover Hitler's men here, neighbors were left to reconcile horrific accusations with the soft-spoken men they thought they knew. In community after community, Americans rose to defend the Nazis living in their midst. The revelations had at first come as a trickle. In the 1950s, we discovered Andrija Artakovich living in California. During the war, he had been the interior minister, a cabinet-level post for the independent state of Croatia, a Nazi puppet state. His Ustaša fascist group murdered hundreds of thousands. He had been in charge of that. But on the floor of the Capitol, when calls came in for his extradition, his congressman bemoaned the persecution that he faced. Right and wrong had been inverted. A decade later, a New York Times reporter knocked on the door of a home in Queens, tracking down a tip that a notorious Nazi camp guard named Hermione Braunsteiner Ryan was living as a housewife. Braunsteiner's cruelty was renowned around the camp. She had become known as the stomping mayor of Majdanek due to her penchant for stomping Jewish babies to death with her jackboots. But again, in an inversion of right and wrong, her neighbors talked about her kindness, said she was so nice when they had puppies, that she was kind to the children in the neighborhood. They were unbothered by her past. By the 1970s, the dam broke altogether. Nazis were everywhere. A bishop in Michigan who had been a propagandist for the Romanian fascist Iron Guard, he had fomented a pogrom in Bucharest that killed the town's Jews. On Long Island, Karl Linus, an Estonian concentration camp commandant, and at the Ford Motor Plant in Cleveland, John Demjanjuk, a death camp guard. All over the country when these revelations happened, neighbors rose to defend the Nazis living in their midst. They said the same lines of defenses, that their pasts didn't matter. All I know is that he is a nice man and a good neighbor. They also all seemed to mention that they were good gardeners. Thankfully, by the late 1970s, Elizabeth Holtzman, a young congresswoman from Brooklyn, demanded that we start taking these cases seriously, that the United States live up to its values. Through sheer force of will, she created the Office of Special Investigations, a dedicated Nazi hunting branch under the Criminal Division at the Justice Department. But they too were immediately met with the same pushback, the same calls to forget the past. They were accused of being McCarthyist, of staging witch hunts not unlike Salem. They were accused of all sorts of conspiracies, often laden with anti-Semitic tropes. The same kind of response happened in Oak Park when Rima and Ray Lynn pushed for Kula to be removed from the high school. They were called ungodly, un-American, and in the local paper, someone even threatened them with gas ovens. And all for what? We had very limited recourse for these cases. The crimes, and they were horrific, were not committed on American soil. Our only legal recourse was deportation. Deportation seems inadequate. Reinhold Kula's crimes were profound. He had worked at the slave labor camp called Gross Rosen in his native Silesia. There he had overseen slave labor at a granite quarry. Slave laborers there rarely lasted more than a month. Some even jumped to their deaths rather than face another day under Nazi control. When he wasn't overseeing slave labor, he was on the perimeter with direct orders to murder anyone who attempted to escape. Death was so common that the crematoria there broke down from overuse. Birds avoided the air in the area around the camp. 120,000 people were enslaved to Gross Rosen during the war. 40,000 were murdered. Kula was eventually deported. First, he was removed from his job at the high school, though the school board didn't want to do that. And they gave him a sweetheart retirement deal, a severance package, paid out his unused sick days, and his colleagues threw him a retirement party. In another inversion of right and wrong, he was celebrated on his way out. They even brought in a student band to play songs from his favorite musical, The Sound of Music. Around the same time that this was happening, Klaus Barbie, the notorious butcher of Lyon, had been caught in Bolivia and extradited to France. Barbie had been responsible for thousands of murders and deportations to Nazi camps like Auschwitz, and upon his return, the French newspaper Le Monde asked its readers a really profound question. Where do you stand on this? Are you on the side of forgetting or of justice? In a now famous line in his book, Zachor, Remember, the historian Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi wondered if the Le Monde journalists had stumbled onto an idea more profound than they had even thought, that perhaps, Yerushalmi wondered, the antonym of forgetting is not remembering, but justice. Perhaps that's really what these cases were. The punishments, of course, lagged significantly behind the crimes, but prison sentences weren't really what these cases were about. They were about ensuring truth. Those who defended Kula and other Nazis needed to invert the truth. Perhaps it was to justify their own relationships with these Nazis. That's reducing that cognitive dissonance they may have felt when they realized that they too had been friends with a monster. But they had to invert the truth, to downplay or deny the atrocities he had committed, which also meant downplaying or denying the suffering that his victims had faced. Indeed, in court, Kula's attorney continually said that Gross Rosen hadn't even been a concentration camp. Towing the line of Holocaust denial, he suggested that it was a mere prison, its victims rightfully interned. To prosecute these cases, the Office of Special Investigations brought witnesses. These witnesses were survivors from the camps. They stood on the witness stand and faced this persecutor, and for the first time for some of them in their lives, they publicly told their story. One was so overcome with emotion that he collapsed in the arms of the survivors that Rima and Ray Lynn were sitting with. They hadn't known each other, but they comforted him nonetheless. But now, the stories that they had previously kept to themselves, that would have otherwise been forgotten, were being told in court, typed up by a stenographer, entered into the legal record, entered into the historical record. OSI also did something unique when it staffed up. It didn't only hire prosecutors, it hired historians. They were not only going to prove that Reinhold Kula had lied on his visa, they were going to unload and uncover every aspect of history that they could, facts that would have otherwise gone unknown and been forgotten. A lot of what we've learned about the Holocaust came from these cases. This case was some of the first scholarship that we have in the English language about the Gross Rosen camp. Other training facilities like Twaniki was uncovered by OSI. They found history that would have otherwise been forgotten and made sure that we remembered. There was another Reinhold Kula that would have otherwise been remembered. A Reinhold Kula that was commemorated in a local newspaper story a couple years before his past came out, where he was the kindly janitor. He had told the newspaper incorrectly that he had been a refugee from East Germany. And it talked about how at events at the school, he was always there, standing guard. But because of Rima and Ray Lynn and the survivors who testified, and heroes at the Office of Special Investigations, Bruce Einhorn, Ronnie Edelman, and Eli Rosenbaum, who worked this case, this is the Reinhold Kula who we remember, the SS officer, the Nazi murderer, not the kindly janitor. Because that's what these cases were really about. A prison sentence is temporary. Inherently, it's ephemeral. It won't last forever. But the truth does. The survivors who testified in these cases were able to document that truth. And the survivors who had come that Rima and Ray Lynn were sitting with, they had come down from Skokie. A few years earlier, a group of neo-Nazis had tried to rally in their town. And how did they respond? Not with demands for prosecution or anything like that, but with documentation, with evidence. They established a speakers bureau. They started going into classrooms. They started writing their stories. They built a museum. And because of them, Illinois became the first state to mandate Holocaust education in the United States. Dozens of other states followed. Because what they, Rima and Ray Lynn, and the Office of Special Investigations understood was that justice can look like a lot of different things. It can look like prison sentences, but it can also look like history. Because there's justice in documentation, and there is justice in remembering. Thank you.